They said I should stay near the back entrance and wear the black apron. When the head waitress asked if I was the catering lady, my son didn't even flinch. He said, "Yes, she's with the kitchen staff." Just like that. Just like I wasn't his mother. Just like 40 years of my life had been a favor I did for strangers. That's what I remember most. Not the music, not the flowers, not the way the champagne sparkled in the light of the chandeliers. But that sentence, delivered with a nod, like business decision. I had arrived at the hotel ballroom carrying 2 trays of his favorite deviled eggs and a tray of almond cookies I'd made by hand the night before. I was wearing my best slacks, the soft navy blouse he once complimented, and low-heeled shoes that still pinched because I hadn't worn them in years. I'd even curled my hair and put on that lipstick he always said made me look alive, as if I was otherwise made of dust. I thought I was coming to a celebration. Of him, yes, but also of me. In the quiet way mothers are often celebrated. By being invited, by being seated near the front, by hearing the word "Mom" spoken in public with some measure of gratitude. I'm 81 now. I live in a small apartment above a used bookstore in a neighborhood where no one knows my history and no one pretends to. I make tea in the mornings and volunteer 3 days a week, shelving novels with faded spines. There's a small kettle I like, a second-hand chair that creaks but holds, and a cat from downstairs who visits me like clockwork every evening at 6. The people here call me Ms. Harlow or Miss M, and they don't ask questions when I bring in tins of shortbread or insist on scrubbing the back shelves myself. It's quiet. It's enough. But that night, the night of the retirement party, the silence I carry now was still far away. Back then, I still thought I mattered to the narrative of my son's life. Back then, I thought a mother could be something other than background noise once the speeches started. When the invitation came, it wasn't formal. It was a forwarded email from Carla, my daughter-in-law, with a line at the bottom that read, "Hope you can make it. We've arranged catering, but feel free to bring your cookies if you want." If I want. That's what she said. Not, "We'd love for you to bring," or "Your almond cookies are his favorite." Just, "If you want," like offering a child crayons during dinner. I baked anyway. Of course I did. I spent 2 days preparing, polishing the silver tray Derek left me in the will, the one with the ornate handles and the tiny etching on the underside that no one ever notices, except him. I wrapped everything carefully, packed it into the back seat of a taxi, and arrived an hour early, like I always do. The young man at the service entrance looked confused when I said I was with the party. When I gave my name, he hesitated, then said, "Oh, yeah. You're with the Caterers, right? You'll be in the back." I should have said something then, should have corrected him, lifted my chin and stated clearly, "I'm his mother. I'm a guest. I'm not here to serve." But I didn't. I've spent too many years smoothing over things. Faces, tensions, hurt feelings, seating arrangements, and the reflex is carved too deep. So I smiled, nodded, and followed the hallway toward the kitchen. The staff barely glanced at me. A woman with a clipboard motioned toward a counter and said, "You can prep over there." The room smelled like onions and bleach. I unwrapped the trays, set them carefully on the counter, and waited for someone to realize the mistake. No one did. Not then. 10 minutes later, Carla swept in, her heels clicking like a metronome, holding a flute of champagne and a clipboard of her own. "Oh, good. You're here," she said without greeting. "Could you help fold the napkins? We're short on hands." I blinked. I thought I'd be sitting with the family. She paused, just long enough for her expression to change, a flicker of something between surprise and irritation. Of course, she said too brightly. But for now, can you just help out a little? The head table is chaos. She gestured to a stack of navy linen napkins and vanished again before I could speak. So I folded, slowly, carefully, with hands that once bathed him after fevers, that paid for his braces, that filled out his college forms, signed loan papers, wrote checks to cover a down payment he swore he'd repay. I folded until my hands stopped shaking. Then I walked out of the kitchen and into the ballroom. The music had started, a jazz quartet, all brass and charm, and the lights were low and warm, like something in a magazine spread. There were clusters of people in expensive suits, women in tasteful dresses, the scent of perfume and prosperity in the air. I scanned the room. There were place cards on every table, small white tents with elegant calligraphy. I looked for my name. I looked for it 3 times. It wasn't there. That's when the waitress approached. Young, blonde, too busy to hesitate. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you with the caterers?" I turned toward her. Before I could answer, Daniel stepped beside me, smiling for the crowd, champagne in hand, tie loosened just enough to seem charming, but not unkempt. "Yes," he said smoothly. "She's helping in the back. Don't worry, we've got everything handled." Then he touched my elbow lightly, not affectionately, not lovingly, but like one moves a vase that doesn't match the room, and turned to shake hands with someone else. I stood there, still, a ghost in an apron. I should have left, should have walked out right then, past the white chairs and gold trim, out into the parking lot and into a cab. But something in me, old, tired, stubborn, said no, not this time. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up a plate, and served myself first. A full plate. Roasted lamb, green beans, potatoes, one of my own cookies. Then I walked into the ballroom, found the nearest empty chair, and sat down. Alone, surrounded by strangers. And I ate. Slowly, deliberately. No one stopped me. No one offered conversation. No one asked who I was. And I didn't explain. Not then. Not yet. Because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the deep inhale before the storm. I don't remember if I finished my plate. I remember the taste of the lamb, the bitterness of the greens, and the dull thud in my chest every time someone laughed a little too loudly at a story I hadn't been part of. I remember the tightness in my throat as I watched Carla clink glasses with a man from Daniel's firm, the one who'd once sent a card after Derek's funeral. As if that small act of paper and ink made him part of my life. I remember the waitress who passed by me 3 times without asking if I needed anything. And I remember the way Daniel looked through me, not at me, not past me, but through me, as if I were a smudge on the glass of the life he'd spent decades polishing. I sat for a while, trying to think of a single moment in the last 10 years when he had looked at me like a son looks at his mother, and not like a man looking at an inherited obligation he'd outgrown. It wasn't sudden, this shift. It had been coming for years. I saw the signs in the small absences, birthdays forgotten, phone calls that grew shorter, invitations that arrived too late to be accepted or too vague to feel real. I made excuses for him, the way mothers do. He's busy. He's tired. He has his own family now. But that night, under the amber lights of that ballroom, with a string quartet playing something elegant and forgettable, I realized none of it was accidental. This wasn't carelessness. It was precision. It was design. I wasn't just forgotten. I was removed, quietly, efficiently, like clutter cleared before company arrives. I stood slowly and returned the plate to the kitchen, placing it gently on the counter like it mattered. The catering manager barely glanced at me as I passed. I walked to the hallway near the restrooms, found a bench meant for coats or children or tired feet, and sat down. My legs ached, and not just from the shoes. I sat there, staring at the floor tiles, each one a perfect square, clean, polished, too uniform to hold memory. I thought about calling a cab, going back to the motel I'd booked, not with them, not part of their weekend plan, but on my own. A modest room with a stiff bed and weak coffee, but a door that locked and lights I could turn off when I chose. But I didn't reach for my phone. Not yet. Somewhere down the hall, I heard laughter. Daniel's laughter. Warm, practiced, performative. The same laugh he used with clients and in-laws and holiday toasts. I used to know the other one, the real one, from when he was small and full of crooked teeth and too many questions. I could make him laugh just by looking at him the wrong way during dinner or making a voice for his mashed potatoes. That laugh had disappeared sometime after high school, replaced by something cooler, more measured, something better suited for conference calls and curated friendships. I hadn't heard the old one in years. My hands were still folded in my lap when Carla appeared. She walked like she owned the floor, heels clicking with intention, chin slightly raised, wineglass in hand, lipstick too perfect to smudge. She saw me, hesitated, then sat beside me with the practiced grace of someone used to controlling rooms. "You okay?" she asked. Not softly, not kindly, but performatively, like someone offering water to a plant they've already forgotten to place in the sun. I nodded. Just needed a moment. She smiled tightly. "It's been a big night. A lot of moving pieces. You know how these things go." I nodded again. Of course. She adjusted the strap on her shoe, looked at her phone, and then added, "Daniel's going to give his speech soon. We should probably get you situated." "Situated?" I asked. "Well," she said, and I swear her voice dipped half a note lower. "We've got the head table filled, but we thought you could sit near the back, closer to the staff table. You know, just in case anyone needs anything. You've been so helpful." I looked at her then, really looked. Not the polished image, not the social veneer, but the woman underneath. The one who'd called me Martha instead of Mom for 15 years, who once told me I was too generous with the children after I bought the twins new coats without asking first. She blinked, waiting. "You want me at the back?" I said flatly. She smiled again, too quick. "It's just more convenient. For everyone." It was in that moment, that exact moment, that the last thread snapped. Not because of what she said, but because I realized she didn't see it as cruelty. It was logistics to her. I wasn't a person. I was a variable, a possible disruption, a wrinkle in the fabric of their perfect evening. The woman who'd raised their father, who'd paid for his braces and stayed up nights ironing his school shirts and drove across the state line to bring him a suitcase he'd forgotten at college. She had become inconvenient, and they didn't even flinch when they moved me. "I see," I said quietly. She stood, smoothing her dress. "Great. I'll let them know. Thank you again for all your help. The cookies were a big hit." She left before I could answer, not that I would have. I wasn't sure I had a voice anymore. Not in that space. Not in that house they built without me. I stayed on that bench for a while, long enough for the music to change and the laughter to drift further. long enough for the first course to be cleared. Then I stood, walked back to the kitchen, took the last 2 almond cookies, and placed them in a napkin. I walked past the waitstaff, past the linen closet, past the double doors where a slideshow was beginning to play. Photos of Daniel shaking hands, Daniel golfing, Daniel with colleagues, Daniel smiling beside Carla on vacation. No childhood photos, no old school portraits, no faded Polaroids of birthday parties or family camping trips. I wasn't in his life story anymore. I wasn't part of the curated mythology. In the lobby, the concierge asked if I needed help finding my ride. I said no. I stepped outside, into the cool air, and stood for a moment beneath the awning. The street was mostly quiet. Somewhere down the block, a cab waited near the corner. I walked toward it, one slow step after another, my heels echoing on the pavement like a metronome ticking down the years. When I slid into the back seat and gave the driver the name of my motel, he glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "Big party in there?" he asked. I nodded. "Retirement," I said, "for someone very important." I held the napkin in my lap the whole ride. 2 cookies. My cookies. The last ones I'd bake for him. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger is hot, fast, consuming. What I felt was colder, heavier, more permanent. It wasn't that he had erased me. It was that he didn't even see the need to pretend I belonged. I wasn't excluded by accident. I was omitted by design. And that, I think, is what broke me. Not the words, not the seating. Not even the lie to the waitress, but the quiet, deliberate, intentional way they removed me from the narrative. With smiles, with grace, with just enough plausible deniability to make me feel like I'd imagined the exclusion. But I hadn't, and I knew that now. I had proof. And I wasn't going to ask to be written back in. The motel room was quiet in a way that didn't ask questions. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and was greeted by the familiar hum of a wall unit struggling against the spring air. The curtains were drawn, the bed neatly made, the carpet worn thin in places that told stories of other tired feet. I sat on the edge of the mattress, still in my party clothes, and placed the napkin with the cookies on the nightstand like it was something sacred. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't check my phone. I didn't call anyone. There was no one to call. I just sat there, back straight, hands resting on my knees, until the silence stretched long enough to make me feel like I had always been in that room, like the party had never happened, like I had only dreamed the laughter and the clinking of glasses and the way my son's voice dropped half a tone when he said I was with the kitchen staff. I took off my shoes first. My feet were swollen, the bones sharp against the thin fabric of my stockings. I peeled them off slowly, wincing as I stood, and walked barefoot to the small dresser against the far wall. There was a mirror above it, not large, not flattering, but it showed enough. I looked at my reflection and tried to find the woman I thought I was. I searched for her in the set of my jaw, the line of my shoulders, the way my lipstick had worn away in the corners of my mouth. She wasn't there. Or if she was faded, flickering like an old slide in a dusty projector. I leaned in, closer, until my breath fogged the glass, and whispered, "You let them do it again." It wasn't accusation. It was fact. The thing about being erased is that it doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, subtly, with practiced hands and polite suggestions. It happens when you're asked not to bring your homemade pie because we've already ordered dessert, when your name disappears from the Christmas card list because it's just easier to use a template, when your stories are gently interrupted or, redirected, or filed under things Mum says. It happens when you become the one who is always available but never expected, the one who is thanked but not remembered, the one who shows up early, stays late, and is never in the photographs. I'd been erased in stages, like a chalkboard wiped clean between lessons. And I had let it happen, because I thought that was what love looked like. Endurance, patience, the quiet willingness to be last so that someone else could be first. I changed out of my blouse and into a soft cotton shirt I kept in the bottom of my suitcase. I brushed my hair slowly, not for appearance, but to feel the pull, the root of something still connected to me. I lay down without turning off the light. The hum of the motel settled into my bones. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured a late-night drama. A faucet dripped with maddening irregularity. I closed my eyes and pictured Daniel at the party, smiling, toasting, thanking everyone who had helped him along the way, everyone except me. I wondered if anyone noticed. I doubted it. His life was a narrative now, tight and controlled. There was no room in it for complication. No room for the woman who once sold her engagement ring to cover the mortgage when his father lost work. No room for the mother who once walked to 3 jobs and skipped meals so he wouldn't feel the sting of poverty. No room for the uncurated, the unglamorous, the real. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. The light outside the window was soft and grey, the kind that doesn't promise anything. I sat up slowly, stretched my aching legs, and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. It wasn't beautiful, but it was mine. The space, the stillness, the decision to stay or leave. It was all mine. I made instant coffee with the machine by the sink, stirred it with a plastic stick, and drank it, standing at the window. Outside, the parking lot was empty, except for a single car with its headlights still on. I watched until they turned off, until the world felt still enough to breathe. By noon, I was walking. Nowhere in particular. Just away from the motel, away from the party, away from the version of myself that still hoped for recognition. My steps were slow, but steady. The sun had broken through the clouds in places, making patches of warmth on the sidewalk. I passed a bakery, the smell of yeast and sugar rising like memory, and for a moment I was back in the kitchen on Elm Street, Daniel at the counter with flour on his nose, asking if he could lick the spoon. I kept walking. I passed a bookstore, a dry cleaner, a flower shop with a handwritten sign in the window. Sunflowers for strength. I paused, looked at the sign, and kept walking. I didn't have a plan, not yet, just an ache in my chest and a growing understanding that something had shifted. I could feel it, like a click in the ribs, something locked back into place. Not strength, not yet, but clarity. I was no longer trying to be invited back into their story. I was beginning to wonder if I could write a new one of my own. Back at the motel, I showered and changed again. I opened my notebook, the one I used to write grocery lists and gift ideas and reminders to take my pills. And on a clean page, I wrote a single sentence. I am not the help. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew it would not involve waiting for someone else to call me back into the room. I would not be seated at the back. I would not wear the apron. I would not fold the napkins. And slowly, in that small, quiet room, I began to imagine the shape of a different kind of life. Not loud, not grand, but mine. By the time the sun had begun to lower itself into the haze of early evening, I had already packed my things. I didn't need much. I never really have. A few clothes, my wallet, a book I'd been meaning to finish for 5 years, and the envelope with my medical documents just in case. I left the napkin with the last cookie on the nightstand, unwrapped, unbothered, like a note in a language only I could read. The motel key I dropped into the slot at the front desk, without ceremony. No one looked up. No one asked if I enjoyed my stay. No one stopped me. That, too, felt like a kind of truth. The way the world doesn't ask about women like me when we walk out of rooms we were never really expected to stay in. Outside, the street was brighter than I expected. The light, sharp, unforgiving. I stood for a moment, adjusting to it, squinting slightly as I pulled my coat tighter around me, even though it was too warm for that kind of gesture. I didn't know yet where I was going, but I knew I wasn't going back. Not to the motel, not to the party, not to the woman who waited for scraps of affection. I walked toward the bus stop like I had somewhere to be. And maybe I did. I just hadn't named it yet. The station was modest, not the kind of place that makes you feel like anything significant is about to begin, and yet it did. I stood in front of the board, looking at the list of destinations, not thinking in terms of geography, but of memory. Each name triggered a sensation. Boston. Cold winters and long walks. Savannah. That one disastrous summer with Derek before the children. Denver. Altitude sickness and a lost suitcase. Portland. Soft rain. Thick books. A coat I once bought on impulse in a shop that smelled like cedar. That was it. That was the one. Portland. Not for logic, for gut, for something unspoken. I walked to the counter and asked for a one-way ticket. The clerk didn't blink. She didn't ask why or where from. She simply processed the payment, handed me the stub, and said, "Gate 5. That small exchange, so devoid of concern, felt like the cleanest interaction I'd had in months. No expectations, no baggage, no performance. Just direction. I sat near the gate, watching people come and go. A woman with a baby slung over her shoulder, a teenager with oversized headphones, a man in a suit who kept checking his watch. No one looked at me. And for once, that felt like relief. The bus ride was long, but not unpleasant. I chose a window seat and rested my bag on the empty space beside me like a barrier. I didn't read. I didn't sleep. I just watched the landscape roll by. Trees, parking lots, rest stops, the backs of towns that never made it into postcards. Somewhere near the border, a child behind me spilled juice and cried. The mother apologized softly. I didn't mind. The world felt wider than it had in years. No longer a narrow hallway between my son's house and my silence. I was, for the first time in decades, somewhere in between, not arriving, not returning, just moving. When we pulled into Portland, it was nearly midnight. The station was half lit, the air dense with the scent of fuel and wet concrete. I stepped off the bus with slow, deliberate steps, letting my feet feel the ground. I didn't rush. I wasn't being met. There was no one waiting with a sign or a question. Just the city, unchanged and entirely new at once. I took a cab to a modest motel I'd found on my phone during the ride. It wasn't much. Beige walls, a plastic plant in the corner of the lobby, a clerk who wore fatigue like a second skin. But it was clean. The room smelled of bleach and neutrality. I liked it. I showered, changed into pajamas, and crawled into bed without checking the news or my messages. I hadn't turned my phone back on since the night of the party. I didn't feel the need. Silence was not punishment. It was space. In the morning, I found a small cafe around the corner, the kind with mismatched chairs and a bell on the door that jingled too loudly. I ordered coffee and a scone, sat by the window, and watched the city breathe. Couples passed by holding hands. Cyclists pedaled with purpose. A dog barked twice before its owner hushed it with a treat. I chewed slowly, not hungry, just grounding myself. The sun pushed through the clouds like someone testing their courage. That's when I noticed the flyer on the corkboard beside the counter. Room for rent. Quiet woman preferred. Shared kitchen. No nonsense. Call Joyce. The paper was slightly crooked, the handwriting blocky and blunt. I liked that. No frills, no flourish. I copied the number and dialed it from the cafe's landline, not ready to turn my phone back on. A raspy voice answered, skeptical. We spoke briefly. She asked my age, if I smoked, if I had boyfriends. I said 81, no, and not in several decades. She said come at 4. I did. The house was faded blue with peeling trim and a porch that sighed under my weight. Joyce answered the door in slippers and a bathrobe, a cigarette dangling from her fingers. You the old lady? She asked. I suppose I am, I said. She nodded and stepped aside. Come in then. The room was small but clean. A twin bed, a dresser, a window that opened. She quoted a weekly rate, cash only. I handed her the bills I had folded in my bra since the morning. She didn't count them, just pocketed the money and handed me a key. You hungry? She asked. I said yes. We ate grilled cheese sandwiches in silence. She didn't ask questions. I didn't offer stories. That felt like a kind of respect. That night, I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. I thought of Daniel and the way he had gestured past me at the party, the way Carla's voice had softened just enough to sting, the way no one noticed when I disappeared. But I also thought of the bus, the way the air shifted at each stop, the kindness of strangers who expected nothing. I thought of Joyce, her sharp tongue and her steady hands, the smell of butter and burnt crust. I thought of the flyer on the wall, crooked and real. I closed my eyes not with fear, but with the quiet certainty that something had begun. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew it would not be shaped by someone else's invitations. I had only lived at Joyce's house for 12 days when the letter came, slipped under the front door in a plain white envelope, addressed in a familiar hand I hadn't seen in years. The slant of the letters unmistakable. The loops like small apologies. It was from Kieran, my oldest grandchild, the only one who ever sat still long enough to ask me real questions, who once spent an entire Saturday building a birdhouse with me in the backyard, who painted it bright red and called it Grandma's Escape. I knew his writing immediately, even before I opened the envelope, even before I saw the single page of lined paper inside. Grandma, it began. No date, no dear, just the word standing alone like a lighthouse. Where are you? Dad and Lisa are freaking out. They said you just left. I've been checking every day. I miss you. Please let me know you're okay. Below that, a phone number. His. A new one. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time, not crying, not trembling, just quiet, as if my body had paused to make space for something else to enter. I didn't call, not yet, but I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of the nightstand, underneath my socks and the small photo of Derek I still carried, not for mourning, but for memory. That night, I stood at the window of my small room, watching the porch light flicker against the damp sidewalk. I thought of Kieran's voice, soft and high-pitched when he was a boy, the way he used to grip my hand with fierce certainty, like he could hold the world together if he squeezed hard enough. I thought of that same boy now grown, now looking for me, And I wondered what kind of man he had become, whether he still believed in birdhouses, whether he remembered that I never once missed a birthday. Something in me softened, just slightly, like ice shifting in a glass. 3 days later, Lisa showed up at the cafe. She came during the quiet hour between breakfast and lunch, when the griddle cooled and the regulars cleared out, when the kitchen smelled more like coffee grounds than grease. She stood just inside the door, wearing a coat too elegant for the drizzle, her expression a mix of practiced calm and barely contained nerves. I saw her before she saw me, and for a moment I did nothing, just watched her scan the room like she was looking for a mistake she had made. When her eyes landed on me, she hesitated, then walked forward, her heels tentative against the linoleum. "Martha," she said, and I noticed she didn't call me Mom, not even now. I turned slowly, wiped my hands on the towel tucked into my apron, and waited. "Can we talk?" she asked, voice low, almost respectful. "You're talking now," I said, not cruelly, just clearly. She winced, the way people do when they realize the playbook is no longer useful. "Privately," she said. I gestured toward the back booth. "It's empty." She slid into the seat across from me like a woman expecting weather. I sat across from her without hurry, folding the towel neatly and placing it beside me. "I didn't know Daniel was sending a lawyer," she began. "That wasn't my idea." "No," I said, "but leaving me in a hotel kitchen was." She looked down at her hands, perfectly manicured, pale pink polish that hadn't chipped. "We panicked," she said. "The kids were loud, the caterer was late, and then you started serving yourself." Her voice trailed off, like the sentence had lost its meaning mid-air. "And you thought I might embarrass you?" I offered. She didn't respond. Just looked out the window at the rain. When she turned back, her eyes were wet, but not weeping. "I didn't want to replace you," she said quietly. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." I stared at her for a long moment. "I'm not your shadow, Lisa. I'm a person." And I finally remembered how to be one. She nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "This is from Kieran," she said. "He wanted you to have it." I took the envelope, not because I trusted her, but because I trusted him. She stood slowly, like someone waking from a dream. "I won't bother you again," she said. "That's not your decision," I replied, "but it would be wise." She left, without finishing the coffee she hadn't ordered. Inside the envelope was a photo. Kieran as a child, 5 or 6, barefoot in my garden, standing beside me with one arm around my neck and the other holding a plastic shovel. We were both laughing. On the back, in Kieran's handwriting, "I remember." Just that. 2 words, but they held everything. That night, I made soup. Joyce sat across from me, peeling potatoes with the efficiency of someone who no longer believed in small talk. "She really came?" she asked. I nodded. "And?" "She left." Joyce grunted. "Good." The next morning, I wrote a letter. Not to Lisa, not to Daniel, but to Kieran. I told him I was safe, that I was not angry, that I wasn't lost, only found somewhere unexpected. I told him he could visit one day, if he came alone. I didn't mail it right away. I kept it tucked inside my cookbook, behind the recipe for lemon squares. A week later, another envelope arrived. Thicker, official. This time from a law firm, the return address typed and sharp. Inside, A letter from a man named Derek Sorensen, representing Daniel and Lisa Harlow, expressing concern about my mental state, offering assistance with my affairs, and inviting me to consider next steps for long-term care planning. I read it once, then again, then calmly folded it and placed it in the drawer beneath Kieran's letter. That evening, I wrote a reply, 3 lines. I am of sound mind and in a safe environment. I do not require assistance. Any further contact will be treated as harassment. I signed it with a steady hand and mailed it the next morning. I didn't tell Joyce. I didn't need to. She watched me place the envelope on the table and said, "Well, that's done." And it was. At the cafe, Heather handed me an extra shift. "You're the only one who shows up early and doesn't complain about the burnt toast," she said. I smiled. Arthur came in later than usual, his cane tapping against the floor like punctuation. He sat at his usual spot, nodded once, and waited for me to pour his coffee. "You look different," he said. "I feel different," I replied. He didn't ask for details. That was the thing about Arthur. He let silence breathe. Later that week, a newspaper article arrived in the mail, a clipping from a community paper back in Wilmington, with a photo of me at some forgotten barbecue, holding a tray of deviled eggs and wearing a smile I didn't remember making. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch, Family Seeks Answers." Quotes from Daniel and Lisa, rehearsed and glossy. "We're very worried," they said. "She's not the type to leave." The type. As if women like me are bound by mold. I laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but one of recognition. I showed it to Joyce. She read it without blinking. "You should sue them for underestimating you," she said. "I'd have to get in line," I replied. That night, I lit a candle, not for mourning, but for marking. I sat at the window, the flame flickering against the glass, and thought of how long it had taken me to understand that absence, when chosen, is not a wound. It's a boundary. It was raining the afternoon Lisa returned, not the light kind that makes you sentimental, but the steady kind that soaks the edges of your sleeves before you realize you've left yourself exposed. I was at the cafe, elbows deep in refilling sugar jars, when Heather looked up from the register and muttered, "Looks like Trouble's wearing heels today." I turned, and there she was, standing near the pastry case in that same pristine coat, pretending to examine the chalkboard menu like she hadn't already rehearsed what she was going to say a dozen times in the mirror. I didn't move. I didn't offer a smile. I finished aligning the jars, wiped my hands, and waited. She saw me then, her mouth tight, her eyes too bright. "Martha," she said again, and I thought how little the sound of your name means when it comes from someone who once erased you in public with a shrug and an upward inflection. "Can we talk?" she asked. "You're already talking," I said, not unkindly, but with the kind of clarity that comes from weeks of silence filled with self-respect. "Privately," she said. I nodded toward the back. "Booth's free." She sat across from me, carefully, like a woman about to confess something not quite forgivable. "I didn't know Daniel sent the lawyer," she began. I didn't respond. She tried again. I didn't want to cause trouble. I met her eyes. "You told the staff I was with the Caterers." She exhaled, long and slow. I didn't say it like that. "You didn't have to," I said. "You didn't correct it. You didn't seat me. You didn't name me." Her fingers twisted the napkin on the table. "I didn't think you'd really leave." I laughed softly. That's the difference between forgetting someone and pretending they were never there. I wasn't forgotten. I was erased. Silence pooled between us. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a slim envelope. Kieran asked me to give you this. I didn't want to come. I told him it was a bad idea, but he insisted. I took it. Not for her. For him. She didn't wait for me to open it. He misses you. He keeps asking questions I don't have answers for. Because you don't remember the things that mattered to him, I said. She nodded, defeated. I wasn't trying to take your place. You couldn't, I said. You just made sure there wasn't one for me at the table. She stood then, quietly, and looked at me for a long moment. I didn't know it would end like this. I shook my head. It didn't end. I just stepped out of the frame. She left without finishing her tea. That night, I opened Kieran's letter. A photograph of the two of us. Him on my lap, me with a book in one hand and his tiny fingers in the other. On the back, he had written, "You were always the one who made me feel like I was already enough." I sat with that for a long time. I held it like a match between two fingers, small but bright enough to light a room. The next day, I went to the bank. I transferred a modest sum to an account he'd given me months ago. Enough for books, for leaving, for beginning. It wasn't a bribe. It was an offering. No strings, just lineage. That afternoon, I wrote a final letter. Not to Daniel, not to Lisa, not even to Kieran, but to their lawyer. It was short. To whom it may concern, I am not in distress. I am not confused. I am not your client's property. Any further contact will be considered harassment. I have retained independent legal representation. Sincerely, Martha Harlow. I signed it slowly, carefully, and mailed it with a stamp that had a small gold finch in the corner, a bird that sings even in winter. I didn't tell Joyce. I didn't need to. That evening, we sat on the porch watching the clouds gather again. She didn't ask why I looked so calm. She just passed me the mug of wine she called Thursday Special and said, "You finally got your hands off the brake." I nodded. "And off the wheel." "I'm just walking now." The next morning, I put on my navy coat, the one I'd bought with my first cafe paycheck, and I walked to the bookstore across from the pharmacy. I asked about volunteer work. The manager, a woman in her 50s with ink on her fingertips and no time for small talk, said, "You know the alphabet?" I nodded. "Start Monday." I told no one. Not even Arthur, who came in that morning wearing his grey jacket and a new scarf that looked suspiciously like it had been folded by someone else. He raised his mug when I poured his coffee. "You've got that look again," he said. "Which one?" "The one that says you finally stopped asking for permission." I smiled. "Took long enough." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Saw this at the art co-op. Thought of you." Inside was a hand-painted magnet in the shape of a birdhouse. "Escape pod?" I whispered, and he didn't ask what I meant. That evening, I pinned it to the refrigerator beside a recipe Joyce had scrawled on a napkin in Sharpie. The house smelled like onions and possibility. I stood in the kitchen and looked around. The cracked tiles, the humming fridge, the cat perched on the windowsill like an opinion. I didn't feel like a visitor. I didn't feel like a problem. I felt present, rooted, finished with asking, done with explaining. I had written my last letter. There would be no more attempts to clarify, no more answers to questions they never cared to ask until I disappeared. The final word had been mine, and for once, it didn't need to be heard to matter. It's been 7 weeks since I mailed that final letter, and no one has come knocking. No more envelopes slipped under doors, no sudden appearances in cafes, no long voicemails dripping with concern disguised as control. The quiet has not been hollow. It has been full of mornings that begin without permission, of walks without destination, of small, ordinary choices that add up to something entirely my own. I have started baking again, not because anyone asked me to, but because I missed the feel of flour on my hands, the slow chemistry of dough becoming something more than itself. Joyce eats what she wants and leaves the rest without commentary. The cat has taken to curling up in my laundry basket. I do not correct her. I have stopped measuring my value in phone calls returned or invitations extended. Some nights I still dream of Daniel, not the man he is now, but the boy he used to be, the one who fell asleep against my shoulder on long car rides, the one who once gave me a paper crown and called me Queen of Saturdays. I wake from those dreams with a deep ache, but I do not chase them. I let them dissolve into the morning light, as memories do when they are no longer required to anchor you. At the bookstore, I shelve poetry alphabetically and find joy in the quiet order of it. There's a small corner in the back with a worn armchair where I sometimes sit during breaks. I've started reading again. Not the things I used to read out of duty or to keep up appearances, but small collections of essays, fragments of lives, sentences that hum with recognition. One day, a customer asked if I worked there, and when I said yes, she smiled and said, "You look like someone who belongs in stories." I didn't know what to say. I still don't. But the sentence stayed with me. Sometimes I repeat it silently to myself, like a thread I don't want to lose. Kieran writes now. Real letters, the kind with stamps and ink that smudges when it rains. He doesn't ask for explanations. He doesn't apologize for things he didn't do. He tells me about his classes, about the girl he likes, about a plant he's trying to keep alive. He ends every letter the same way. I'm still building. You were right about needing strong walls. I keep his words in a shoebox beside the bed, beside old photographs and new receipts. Proof of a life no longer filtered through someone else's lens. Sometimes I pass women on the street who look like versions of myself from another life. Eyes cast downward, hands gripping tote bags too tightly, expressions that flicker between hope and exhaustion. I want to stop them. I want to say, "You are not furniture. You are not favor. You are not a fixture in someone else's home." But I do not speak. Not yet. Instead, I bake extra. I leave things at the cafe with little notes. For whoever needs reminding that they're real. The staff thinks it's a customer. I let them. Some truths are sweeter when they don't need attribution. I'm not angry anymore. That's the strangest part. The absence of fury does not mean acceptance. It means I chose the door. I chose the walk. I chose the silence not as punishment, but as soil. A place where something else could grow. I don't want to go back. Not to their parties, not to their tables, not even to the stories I used to tell myself about what a mother should tolerate in order to be loved. I don't want revenge. I want peace. And I've found it in the smell of yeast, in the rhythm of spines being shelved, in the soft weight of a letter signed with care and not obligation. So if you're reading this, if you are a woman whose seat was quietly removed from the table, whose hands were expected, but whose face was blurred in the photograph, whose voice was softened until it disappeared, let me tell you this. You are not gone. You are not invisible. You are not past tense. You are here, and you get to begin again.